Welcome. You are here for the first ever Providence Live webinar. So we are hoping for a truly interactive experience with you as we look through some of the challenging things we all encountered in this week's journey reading through the book of Judges. But first, we need to do a few introductions, and I need to give you some information about what this evening is going to look like. I'm Chase Phillips. I'm the student minister here, and I will serve as the moderator, which is a fancy word for trying to keep Cheri Hogrefe in check. And so I will introduce these faces soon, but I want you to know how you're going to be involved in this. This is not just listen to us for talk. It's you will be involved with all this as well. So the first thing we want you to do is to submit questions. You can go in the chat. You can drop questions for us to try and answer and try to respond to and just create some discussion off those. So go ahead and start submitting those questions now, even as I speak. The next thing I want you to be aware of is that you are able to raise your hand. And so I can't look at Cheri. You can raise your hand, and if you go at the bottom of your screen there, you can raise your hand, and we will be able to see you doing that. And some of you are, I'm seeing some hands come up. And you can lower your hand by pushing the same button again. I see that hand. I see that hand. Amen. We got lost salvations already. This is amazing. So that's how you can raise your hand. We might do that throughout the thing here. The next thing you can do is we'll have random polls pop up, and not like polls for like structural polls, but polls that you can answer a question. And so you can submit those, just click the one you think is the right answer, and we will discuss those as well. So with all that, so yeah, you can submit questions, you can raise your hand, you can answer the poll questions, and so forth. So let's just go ahead and we're gonna do our first poll to kind of test it out and see if this is working properly. Our first poll is how long you've been at Providence. And if that doesn't work, we'll have other ways to do that. But while the poll is running, we're gonna have all three of our panelists here introduce themselves. And so I'm gonna ask each one to tell us their name, what they do for a living, and their favorite COVID-19 snack. So I'm gonna start with Cheri.
Hey everybody, I'm a recently new video editor, so I edit videos for children's ministry. I also write a little bit of curriculum. Let's see, my favorite COVID snack is pork rinds.
I love your manicure, pedicure. Looks really good. So, all right, Matt.
I'm Matt Giles. I have, what am I? I've been at Providence a couple of years, almost 2 years, I think, somewhere around there. No, year and a half, 18 months, something, I don't know. Anyway, I am the missions guy at Providence, and my favorite COVID snack or whatever, I drink these because I just like chemicals. Just like to drink chemicals. So Coke Zero's my thing.
All right, before we go to David, if you're having trouble with the poll icon, there at the bottom of your screen, you can click on, I think where it says more, and then there's participants, things like that. You might see the word poll, and you can take that from there at the bottom of the menu. If it's not there, we'll move on. It's fine. So David, introduce yourself, please.
David Belitz. I don't work for Providence Church. I'm not a minister at the church, and I'm an accountant. So if you have any math questions, I'm all about those tonight. But I'm also a small group leader for the high school boys here at the church, and my favorite snack is for COVID-19 is sour cream and onion potato chips, because why not?
That's awesome. All right, so as we embark on this, we may encounter some technical difficulties. The poll is not really working right now, so if you're not seeing that come up, don't worry about it. We will ask you to raise your hand, virtually speaking. But thanks for coming out tonight. We're going to go ahead and get started. But again, make sure that at the bottom of your screen, you can submit questions for these guys to discuss and talk about. So be sure and do that. And so just to kind of get the juices flowing here, we've been in the book of Judges as we've been going through the whole Bible and what we call the journey. And so we are closing out Judges tonight. So Judges has a lot to do with Israel's like chaotic, bloody history. It's a dark time for the Israelites. Lots of shame, lots of darkness, lots of craziness going on, and we're seeing all that's kind of unfolding. But to kind of get the conversation going, I'm going to ask each panelist to kind of tell us their favorite part of the book of Judges, what kind of stuck out, what was something fresh this time through. I'm going to start with me to kind of give you guys some time to think through what your answer might be, but mine was obviously when Lefty killed Hefty. I mean, Ehud, Egon. I mean, that was epic. Now, the 18-inch sword going all the way into the gut. I mean, my first gut reaction to that was just like intense. I mean, I just couldn't imagine that scenario. So reading through that was really crazy to me, and just to see how, epic these stories are. But all right, we'll start with David. What's your big takeaway? What was your big, as you read through the book of Judges, what stuck out to you?
What stuck out for me? So it's just amazing the different ways that God redeems his people, or saves his people, let's say. There's surprising ways every time. You've got the Lefty killed Hefty, but you got Samson who never cut his hair. I mean, there's just so many different ways. He just shows up in surprising ways, even though Israel had drifted so far away so quickly and so many times.
All right, Matt, what do you got? What stuck out for you?
No specific event probably came to mind any different than normal, but I think just weighing again how heavy and bloody and dark this book is. Just being reminded of what it looks like when everybody just does whatever they want to do. So I think that's probably for me the biggest takeaway, is just to be reminded of that. I mean, they had no king. That's the most important emphasis, is that there was no king, and man, that's always what sticks out when I read it. But would this not make a great movie? I mean, this is like a series on Netflix or something. I don't even know. It may be too rough for Netflix. It may have to be like HBO or something.
It would be an HBO special, no doubt. I mean, it's gory. It's lots of detail in there.
It's really good. It's great if you like
All
it.
Right. All right, Cheri, what was yours? I'm interested to see what you got. You're muted.
Sorry, unmute. Sorry.
I thought you were cussing. You were just muted. That makes more sense.
I mean, I'm tempted to talk about Deborah in jail from Judges chapter 4 because it's a great story. But I guess bigger than that, just if I had to like back up and think about Judges as a whole, I think that many people today think that we're in the worst time we've ever been. And I would argue that Judges lets you know that there's nothing new under the sun. Like you read Judges and you go, oh, I don't know. Like I think they would compete with a really, really bad time. Like the things that were happening was even worse now. If we experienced a story like Judges 19, we would be outraged today. And that it happened back then. So I don't know. I just kind of think that the Bible is never out of date. It's just always relevant to everything we're going through. So that just kept, popping up in my head.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, reading through the book of Judges with, a global pandemic going on and just all the stuff, it kind of brings it into a new perspective. As we kind of transition into some kind of the more nitty-gritty details of this discussion, I just want to remind you that you can submit questions. I'm not seeing any come up, but I would love to kind of see what you guys have gotten through reading this book. Now questions are pouring in now. I feel like I'm hosting like a telethon. You can call now, and we will give you money or whatever, however that works. Anyway, so as these questions start coming in, We have a few that Chad had actually gotten via email, and so we're going to kind of discuss those a little bit as questions start to pour in here. And so kind of talking with, this whole idea of these rulers coming up, these judges. Now, when it says judge, don't think of like Judge Judy, obviously. So there's like these generals, these rulers who God has raised up to save the Israelites from, being slaves to somebody. And so as you kind of think through these judges, this is a ragtag group of people. And so just kind of asking the question, why would God raise up a man or these people with such appetites for sex and appetites for violence and just self-promoting, violent? I mean, you could argue dumb. It's like guys like Samson. So as you kind of think about that, what do you see? How do you see God working through these rulers and these leaders? Like, why is he raising up such grotesque characters to carry out his will? And so, David, specifically talking about Samson, what are your thoughts on that? Why would God raise up these leaders like a guy like Samson?
I think Samson's a great story of untapped potential. And he was, an angel announced his birth. He was set aside with the Nazarite vow. He had all of this going for him, and God gave him just unimaginable strength. And yet he was, a lot of things. He was a narcissist. He violated almost all of the Nazarite vows. He touched the dead body of the lion to get the honey out. He chased women. We're pretty sure he was a big drinker. All those things he wasn't supposed to do. So yeah, when you look at it like that, it's like, why did God pick a person like this? But I really think the way to look at it is more about God uses Samson in spite of all the issues he has. It gives us hope today that no matter what's wrong with us, you can't be too sinful for God to use. For him to reach out, to call you to him and say, I can make a change in you. You can never be too far away from God. So I think, the way I look at it is, it's not, gosh, what a terrible person Samson was. Why did God pick him? It's, wow, God can use Samson despite all of his flaws to accomplish his purpose. Because I think that's the real story there, is God uses tools. He uses people the way they are, where they are, to accomplish his will, and he gets the glory for it.
Yeah. That's great. Matt,
let me talk real quick about what a Nazarite is, because that was one of the questions.
Yep.
And this is kind of an interesting connection to us today, I really believe, because Nazarites were to be set apart, very similar to the idea of being holy, right? Sanctified, being set apart. The words that are described for us, that was the process of salvation when that we're going through as we mature in our faith, right? We're to be set apart, we're to be holy. So if you think about him, there's three main ways, if I remember correctly, because I don't have it written down, so I'm going off my memory. But a Nazarite committed to never cut their hair, never go near anything that was of the vineyard. So no drinking wine, not even technically, I don't think they were to be around anything that was of the vineyard. And they were never to be near a dead body, which, you're thinking to yourself, why did we read Leviticus? Well, if you go back and think about some of the things that made people impure or unclean, like being near a dead body would have made you impure or unclean. And as we've learned, it's not that those things are inherently sinful, but it's that any impurity in, the midst of a holy God is considered dangerous, right? So Samson was to be set apart as different, unique, a leader of Israel, and to model that. And if you think about the things David said, he broke his Nazarite vows repetitively throughout the story, even to the very end when he finally reveals that he's not supposed to cut his hair. So I hope that answered the question about what a Nazarite is.
Yeah. So speaking of not cutting your hair, Matt, do you have anything you want to follow up with?
Just expand on the Nazarite thing. It comes from number 6. That's where the reference is that Cheri's quoting from memory, which is pretty impressive. But number 6 talks about the details and everything, and Moses kind of addresses it. And it is, the word Nazarite means consecrated or separated one. And so that's kind of what that picture is. And you see that kind of run through into the book of Acts, where there's a passage where You see somebody, well, Paul ends up, it says that he cut his hair because of a vow. And so it's just kind of a reference that we see through there. But Samson, really, I think he is set up as this leader who is this tragic person with all of these flaws, and he is as wretched as you could possibly be. But what you're really looking at in all of these judges is the progression of how each of them represent how Israel was falling apart in the process of Judges. So where you see Joshua passes, then we enter into the book of Judges, and you see this process where these judges are representative of Israel's sin. So in a lot of ways, Samson was exactly what they needed because he represented them. He was a picture of that. And so that's where you see this contrast where you're not looking at he's not a king. He's not a worthy king. But he's a representative of what Israel was at the time because they had just kind of turned away. Well, they had completely turned away from God. So, but I think that's part of the reason why God raised them up. They're examples of what Israel is without God, just like we are without God.
That's great. So here's a question that someone submitted in the Q&A board. In Judges 6, we see Gideon testing God with a fleece. I was surprised when Gideon asked for a second test of God. Are there other examples where people would crest a second test of God? Just general thoughts on, why would Gideon ask a second time? Is that okay? Like, why is that a good thing, a bad thing? What are your all's thoughts? We'll start with Cheri. You want to start with that?
No.
All right. David.
Oh.
Okay. I figured you were joking, but I could never tell with you.
Me? No, I wasn't joking. I have
Oh,
no idea.
Oh, okay. Well,
No,
just to kind of.
Okay.
When I read that, it's funny because we're reading contextually, feeling into it.
Right.
And so for me, when I'm reading that, it feels disrespectful for Gideon to even ask the test. So when he asks a second time, my emotions feel like it's wrong. But if you think about the way, there are many, many times when people talk to God that I have felt uncomfortable about the way they have talked to God. Abraham, when he would talk to God and be like, okay, but wait, will you just let me intervene, whatever. Or Moses was like, God, don't you remember your covenant? And I'm like, my cultural bias inflects on that passage. And I go, I can't imagine speaking to God this way. But there seems to, I think I'm wrong is what I'm saying. I think I'm injecting my emotional bias into that text. And I don't know. I think he was really wanting to do God's will. I think he wanted to be clear because at that time, you're thinking about, 7 years where the Midianites and they've been oppressing them. And then when Gideon, he comes up to Gideon and raises him and says, okay, hey, go do this, mighty warrior. And Gideon's hiding. He probably doesn't feel like a mighty warrior. It feels like he is truly just asking God to be sure. So the second time it's like, okay, if you will, just permit me this one more time. I want to make sure I'm doing the right thing because of his status among his house, his clan, his tribe. He's the youngest. I don't know. So I think that we have to be careful not inflecting our own feelings into the text as if what he did was wrong. But I don't know that I'm right on that. That's just my take.
Yeah. I mean, just kind of going off those same lines. When I first read it, I had the same thought too. It was like, I wouldn't want to doubt God. I mean, that was a pretty good sign in my opinion. If that happened to me, I would say that was good enough. But there again, I'm probably wrong on that as well. But you also see Jesus, in the garden. If there's any other way, I mean, that's the Son of God with all knowing power and knowing everything. Just want to make sure if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but your will be done. And so I don't know if that's a correlation or not, but Matt, you got any thoughts on that?
I just think that, it's difficult for us to put systems. I think what Cheri's saying is right. I mean, when you start trying to create patterns or systems and things like that, a lot of times we miss what's going on in the narrative of what they're trying to say. I think it's more of an emphasis of him just saying, he's wanting to know. I don't know. There's probably some real depth in that I don't have. But I think what he said was, I asked because it seems to be more egregious than some of the other happenings in prior readings that followed with God's wrath. And that's highly possible. I mean, I can see that too.
Yeah. David, do you have anything to throw in there?
I mean, I think they covered the bases.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I just come back to you. It doesn't, not that it's right or wrong. I don't think it's a bad thing to go back to God and say, hey, did I hear this right? Am I clearly understanding this? And I mean, I think you got to also read about Gideon. He wasn't exactly the bravest dude in the world to start with. So he's probably thinking, there's just me and against all those people. And I don't really want to do this, God. So I'm going to ask you one more time just because I really don't want to do this.
Let's make it incredibly clear, because, I mean, he wasn't the bravest judge at the forefront. I mean, he needed a lot of encouragement, which I can totally relate to. So kind of going back to Samson now, there's questions kind of coming in about Samson. So how do you deal with, we have one question here. It says, consider that we have a culture today that opposes toxic masculinity. Can you speak on the thought that Samson was enticed to reveal his strength? It's had this person thinking that men may need to be more reserved rather than caving to the expectations of current culture for them to be so sensitive. So talking about biblical masculinity, I'm thinking like I can hear Chad at Manday now kind of talking through this, but just kind of talking about biblical manhood and masculinity. Is Samson a good biblical, ideology to kind of follow, or what are your thoughts on that? Would you use this to train up some men?
Since I talked about Samson first, I'll start and then let them correct me. But my take on it is no. I don't think Samson's a very good example. I think he's a train wreck. His masculinity was what got him sidetracked, because he trusted in it more than he trusted in God. Because even if you listen to his song about killing the Philippians, it's what I did. He never says, look what God did through me or anything like that. So I think he is an example of masculinity that is prideful, that is very self-centered and not God-centered. And his strength, we know, came from God. And I think biblical manhood is about being a servant leader like Jesus was. The strength comes from the spiritual strength, and showing that strength in the actions and in the way you present yourself and the way you handle yourself, the way you treat others, including your wife, or your girlfriend or whoever it is. That's the importance of biblical manhood. But I personally think Samson is an absolute train wreck when it comes to trying to use him as any type of example.
Yeah.
Well, I think he's a good example of what you see in culture when, you just live for yourself. And we know that we are not our own, we're not very effective gods, even though we would choose to be. I mean, that's part of what the fall was, is this desire to go outside of the garden, to say, hey, I want to know good and evil. I want to be able to manage this thing on my own. And the thing about Samson is his masculinity is that kind of insecure, on just keeping everything right there at the surface, a really thin-skinned person who is quick to anger. Obviously, he's quick to his his desires, his sexual desires. He really is, in a lot of ways. I think he might be a picture of what toxic masculinity looks like. I mean, this idea that you just kind of are this raging person who's pounding beers and chicken wings and sleeping with whoever you can sleep with. And that's obviously not what God intends a man to be. A man is strong in their restraint. A man is strong in their discipline. We are at our strongest point and our most effective point and our most God-glorifying moments when we are men and our strength is in God and who he is. So, when you see a man who's able to resolve himself to handle an insult or restrain from uncontrolled anger, when you see that, that is real strength. And that's strength that it really requires a king. So if we're talking about Samson not having a king and toxic masculinity is not having a king, the kind of masculine strength that we see in Scripture and that what we want to have and aspire to be, and what Chad teaches on Man Day, is this idea that God is big enough to fight our battles for us, so we can be restrained, and that when we are strong, it's strength for other people. So I don't think we look at Samson and see any kind of positivity about masculinity. His strength is something that we do live in a culture right now where it's kind of a denial of the strength of men. There's all this overlap and blurred ideas of gender and understanding. And so you guys have probably seen in the news some of these places where there's kind of gender confusion, or someone says they're identifying in another gender, and then they just kind of dominate a female sport, a man who has done that. There is something that unique, and men are unique, and we're in the image of God, unique in that, and there is a strength in that. But Samson's not our example for sure. But he is an example of I think just that petty other side of it, just the insecure macho man. Cheri, you know about this. Tell me a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I just want to add one thing is I think we have to remember that, and this is one of those weird things, I'm not trying to open up like a can of worms, but I mean, God knew what he was doing by raising up Samson. He wanted the kind of guy that Samson was. He wanted to stir the pot. God wanted to cause a reason for them to go to war. He says that. That's why Samson's going after that Philistine wife. It's like, but they did not know that God was moving to cause action. So there's this thing where I think we have a misinterpretation that we think God is always going to raise up these honorable men of integrity, to do this thing, when in reality, sometimes God works within the culture of that time. And in the culture of that time, women were not worth anything. They were completely inferior. They were of monetary value, traded off for different reasons. So you're thinking about, in that time, what they needed was somebody who would absolutely get things stirred up between the two. And so Samson absolutely fulfills completely that role for what, in that time, what God wanted to do. So I don't think that God is doing that and raising up Samson and saying, hey, be like Samson. I think he's actually in the midst of what he's doing in Israel. It's twofold, because Israel is kind of getting what they deserve. They're getting the judge they deserve at that time for the way that they were.
Yeah, I think what he's saying is, through the message of Judges, is not be like Samson, but you are like Samson. When you don't have me, or you're not surrendered to me, you are like Samson. So you get a judge that looks like you. That's what he's putting on Israel. And then we are reflecting that, or understanding that, because that's the message. The message is when there is no king, and this cycle, and that's what this is. Of course, in Judges, there's this process that's going on. They wouldn't drive out the Canaanites. Since they wouldn't drive the Canaanites out, you had this kind of adoption of Canaanite values. Then God would allow the Canaanites to rule over them and oppress them. They would repent, right? And there was this cycle going on because they were not trusting in the one king. They were not doing it. And I think that's a great example. He's the leader. He's maybe not the one they wanted, but he's the one they needed, right? So that's a good picture of it.
Hey, before we move on from Samson, there was a question over here about the Spirit of the Lord rushing on Samson 3 different times, I think, and they're asking what is the significance of that phrase. So I know that it seems like we're kind of wrapping up Samson and moving on. We might, let's address that before we finish.
Yeah. Do you have a stab at it, or do you want just a...
Sure, yeah, I can. This is one of those things too, where I think there's a lot of different theories on how the Spirit works in the Old Testament. And so without getting into all the different theories, the one thing that I think is clear, and if you just simply were doing a study of the word spirit throughout the Old Testament, you'll see that the Spirit comes on and leaves at certain times with Old Testament people. So, I mean, and you look at the 3 times where it happens, it's right before Samson's going to do something really, really great. He gets his power, obviously, from the Spirit of the Lord. And the significance of it is that he is receiving power from God. I mean, I don't know how else to look at that. Like, this is not something that Samson is doing on his own. He's not able to manipulate the Spirit in any way. Like, this is the Spirit doing this. So obviously, whatever is going on, again, we've already talked about this. Like, this is God's choice of a leader. This is God's man at that time, what he was doing through him. And I think every time you see that phrase, the Spirit of the Lord, either it says began to stir in him or rushed upon him, right? The next thing that happens is he does something incredible, some feat that's like not, I mean, you can read some of these things, and if you're not careful with our hero world, you know, the Avengers and stuff, you can kind of fall into fantasy. But I mean, he's killing 1,000 men. I mean, it's ridiculous. He's catching 300 foxes and tying tails together. Like, who among us could catch a fox? If I could, I'd be raising a baby fox by now. Like, I can't. So I just think that, you know, when you look at that, the significance is this is God's choice, and he is working through Samson. So everything he is doing, whether he's tearing a lion apart or, you know, going down to the other city and taking 30 men's clothes or tying the foxes together, what he's doing is by the Lord. He's getting his power from God.
All right. So as we kind of transition to another topic, let me see a show of hands. If you're enjoying this so far and everything's kind of clicking with you guys, as we want to make sure we are keeping you guys involved in the chat here. So there's the hands, loving it. Little blue high fives everywhere. Love it. So keep that in mind as we do that, and keep submitting questions. Now, this one is coming up quite a bit. We have, you know, a daughter being sacrificed, and I mean, there's a lot here to kind of discuss. I'm scrolling back up looking for the original question, but here it is. Can you please comment on, I'm saying Japheth's daughter. I don't know if that's the right way to say it or not. I'm just going to say it fast and confident. Daughter being offered to the Lord. This is coming from someone from the line of Jephthah. So anybody want to take a stab at that? I mean, that's a tough question. Anybody? Matt, you looking pretty confident.
No, I'm not. Yeah, I don't know if I got enough reference to answer his question on that. Let's see. Somebody grab at it. I'm not gonna do it. I can't do it. I could gibberish about this, but I'm not going to.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough thing, and I think that's where, you know, to kind of start with the idea of, you know, sacrificing something. Like, I mean, that's a tough thing when you read it, especially in the Old Testament. You know, a sacrifice such as that, it's a weird thing to kind of process. But
I mean, there are 2 theories. There are 2 main theories. One theory is that he actually did offer her as a burnt offering. The other theory is that when you see in that story that she goes up to mourn her virginity, the other theory is that she would be basically, her availability as a wife would be taken from her, and that she lived forever unmarried and unattached. And one of the things you can see with that, I'm not saying which one is correct. I've read a lot on this, and there's a lot of good things on both sides, both arguments to be made. But if you see at the end of chapter 11, it says that the daughters of Israel went year by year to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in a year. Some people think that they're going up to her and like mourning, grieving with her, that she's unable to marry, bear children, leave a lineage, or anything like that. Some actually believe that when he made the vow, that he followed through and offered her as a burnt offering. Obviously, one thing we can take from that, we know that's not prescribed by God, because if you think about all the times he talked to the people about the way the Canaanites worshiped, that child sacrifice was very common with Molech, with however you say that, Chemosh or Chemosh god, whatever, the Moabite god. Child sacrifice was pervasive throughout the land. So that could go both ways. That could go the fact that Jephthah was influenced by child sacrifice and was willing to do that. But obviously when he makes the vow, he's not thinking of his daughter, because when she comes out the door, he's incredibly grieved that that's who came out the door. Now, who did he think was coming out the door? I don't know. A goat, an animal, a servant? I have no idea. So I don't know that we can know for sure whether he actually offered his daughter as a burnt offering, or whether he just offered her to be consecrated to the Lord and, refused to allow her to be married. Either way, I think it's a rash vow. And if he did offer her as a burnt offering, I don't think that was God's will, that he would have wanted that.
Well, I think that's the other part of it is, God's pretty clear that several places in the New Testament, several other places in the Old Testament, that, vows are not to be taken lightly and that really we shouldn't be doing them. And I think this was just because, like Cheri said, it was a rash vow. I think he would have been just as right to say, that was stupid. I shouldn't have done that. And instead I'm going to offer a bull, or whatever. I don't think this is one where God would have held him accountable and said, no, you made that vow, you have to follow it through. I think that's just stupidity on his part versus actually God trying to hold him to that type of vow. Because even in the, I don't remember where, so some of you biblical scholars here can quote this for me, but you could buy, take for plus 20% and buy something away from, or redeem it from, I guess is the better way to say it, from being sacrificed. So, he had a process to go through where he could have dealt with this in a better way. I did read one commentary where it said that he dedicated her to temple service, even though we're not talking the temple yet because they haven't been built, but the tent meeting. So I don't know. I think it was just rash on his part to begin with. It was just a bad vow to start with.
Yeah.
I think Darla Sparks made a comment I like. She saying she really she says that this is an example of how Israel began looking like the Canaanite groups. I think that is the cycle. I mean, what you continually see is them being syncretized with the Canaanite belief system. And this is a good example of that, the sacrifice of the daughter. It definitely is not like this parallel to Isaac or anything like that. There's nothing in that radar. So that's a good comment.
I think the problem we have with stories like that is that God is silent. I think that bothers us because I think that we would feel a whole lot better if God stepped in and was like, Jephthah, you're an absolute idiot. Like, what were you doing making that vow? Take it back, sacrifice something else that costs you a whole lot, whatever. But if you think about his vow, he asked God to give him victory. And he vowed, if you give me the victory, I'll do this. So he feels attached to this idiotic vow. But I think our struggle is that we don't hear God comment either way on what's happening. So we're left with our emotions tangled in with how we feel about what we read to try to make a comment on how we feel about it. And I think that's where it's a little bit of a struggle. We have to be very careful not to read our emotions into what like God's silence means. Like, well, if he's not saying it's wrong, then he must have been okay with it. That's not the way the Bible works. So
especially Judges doesn't work that way. I mean, Judges is kind of this raw expose of like how we look when we just are absolutely unrestrained, and letting everything that's around influence us and all those things. And that's what the scripture, that's great, Cheri. That's I appreciate you saying that. That really helps me to be able to describe it. Just the dynamic of it's not a commentary. We're always looking for that, and God's not interested in giving us that until he wants to give that to us. So that's a really good narrative.
Yeah. So kind of speaking along this idea of just these messed up situations. I mean, Judges 19, we could spend several hours in this chapter alone. And I was doing reading some commentaries on this. And one commentary said, just read the first verse and skip the chapter. I mean, because it's a crazy chapter. Let me see a show of hands of people that have read Judges 19. If you've read that and you have just like not want your kids to read it, or you just can't imagine the scenario going down. See, all the hands kind of coming in with, I mean, if you've not read Judges 19, you need to go read that. Not for enjoyment's sake, but as we kind of discuss this, there's a few things that kind of come up that are major issues today, and just major. I mean, you just see the total depravity of this. And so, as you think through Judges 19, Matt, we'll kind of start with you. You see this almost flashback to Sodom and Gomorrah, and there's this group of guys threatening to get into this house to have sexual relations with the new guy in town, and it's obviously a same-sex desire here. And so, just by a show of hands, I mean, if you are close with somebody that has homosexual desires, those kind of things, my family, we have people in my family that struggle with that. And so it's obviously just with the hands I'm starting to see, it's an issue that is prevalent today. And it's a thing that our culture is very aware of. And so when you think about these homosexual desires, and just especially right here in the book, just right here in Judges 19, I mean, what do you do with this? I mean, discussing homosexuality within the Bible, both what it signifies and it's the consequences of it. Just kind of like, what do you kind of see here with this passage particularly, but kind of expound upon that a little bit?
Well, I think that it's hard to in Judges 19, it's hard for me to take the homosexuality, just that brief reference, and kind of isolate it, but to put it inside the category of all the sexual sin that's going on in that situation, because it is terrible. I know we're going to discuss, or I hope we get to talking about the women's issue side of this, because there's some real struggles in the value and understanding of women being part of the image of God and the way this chapter works. But to me, I think what we're looking at when we see homosexuality, especially in the Old Testament, is a reference to kind of the extreme rebellion that we will embrace when we are left to our own passions. So it makes me think about Romans 1, where he talks about, I pulled that up, just thinking about this. Romans 1:26 says, "For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error." One of the hardest things, I think, for this issue, especially in our culture right now, is we are identified in our strongest desire. So the real cultural identity, especially in America, the cultural identity that we have is whatever your strongest desire of accomplishment is, that's who you are, that's your identity. So, when sexuality, which is so hyper pushed and promoted as the real answer to your life, when that gets pushed and then this temptation starts to happen, when you're driven by that, we have in our culture embraced that. So you are that. That's your identity. That's what you are, is that one behavior or desire that you have. And I think what's happening in Judges 19 is a picture of, and I think it is supposed to reference Genesis 19, talking about Sodom and Gomorrah. I think there's supposed to be a connection there for us to be able to say, I think the author of Judges is saying, hey, it was so bad, it looked exactly like what was going on at Sodom and Gomorrah. Israel had fallen apart so bad that they were in the place where they're just going for their passions aggressively. But we're living in a culture where I think when you address this kind of passage, the hard thing you have to do is you have to make sure and frame it up in sin is this temptation to go against the way of God, the will of God, the creation of God, what God has done. And so that's the deeper side of this. I've heard people phrase it as it's an issue of same-sex attraction, which I do think that's a good terminology. And I think we can embrace that in some way to say that it is just another temptation that we can have. But I do think it's a little deeper, because it does go out against the actual Genesis identity of roles of creation. And so I think that's what's happening in 19. I think what we're seeing is the author trying to say things were so bad, that passions were so out of control, that they exchanged everything that belonged to God and was created for God, in the image of God, for the glory of God. They took all that and they destroyed it. And they were living as aggressively as they possibly could outside of that. And I guess that's what I'm starting to preach here. I'm sorry. I guess what I would say in response to that is, if you're somebody who's on this forum, or you know somebody, that can sound incredibly harsh. And I know when you see somebody who's struggling with the temptation of their flesh, a lot of times we start to want to empathize with them. And in a way, that's okay, because when you've ever tried to deny yourself for the cross, it's hard. But I don't think we can go down the road of saying this is just something you were born that way, and this is just something we got to embrace. I think it is a form of rebellion, just like any kind, and repentant people are running from that rebellion. And so it's a tough passage, because we're not looking at guys who restrained and then it was like, wow, now they went to Sunday school and everything was awesome. They end up going from there, and then they start raping women. So it's not like we're talking about homosexuality is bad, but we got that under control. And then these guys, they behave themselves. There's another side to this too. And I don't know if we're going to address that too, Chase.
Yeah, and we can go right there now. I mean, because when you think about this sexual desire, it's really, and when you identify same-sex attraction as one sin, that I can conquer that, and that person struggles with that, but I don't. But all sin is denying myself and picking up my cross and following Jesus. And so really sin has to come with self-denial. And so it's denying that my identity is not built on my sexuality. It's not built on who I am as a person. My identity is in Christ, purchased by Christ and for Christ. And so, and it's like you said, I mean, it's not just the same-sex sexual desire. It's not like, let's just attack this issue. It's also, they just had this insatiable desire for sex. And so the story goes on, and hopefully you guys have read that. I mean, this guy throws out, a concubine. And so let's just see kind of a quick poll. This was one of our poll questions as we kind of transition here, but let's just do this. If you want to comment down here at the comments, what you think a concubine is, and it's not a piece of farm equipment. I do know that. But when you think of the word concubine, that comes up a lot, especially in the book of Judges, where you're going to see it a lot with Solomon and so forth. But kind of like, I would love to see what you all are thinking that a concubine is. I think people are kind of scared to do that. But anyway.
Let me add one thing, Chase.
Yeah,
kind of like, instead of being close up, I want to just back up a little bit, because when you think about like homosexuality, especially in Judges 19, it's like the symptom. And you said there's something deeper. And whenever you're reading your Bible and you see a repeated phrase, it's not an accident. It's not an error. Okay. The author is making a key point. And the repeated phrase, you've got three of them really throughout the book of Judges. One is the Israelites did evil. One is there was no king in Israel. And one is everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So back up and just go, okay, in chapter 18, opening line, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Chapter 19, opening line, in those days, when there was no king in Israel. There was a king in Israel. It was God. They're in a theocracy. God's their king. So when this author is saying there is no king in Israel, he is not talking about a literal king. He is saying Israel is not acknowledging authority. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then go to Romans 1, because Matt, you read 26, but if you back up, it's this pattern of degradation that starts with removing authority in your life. Mm. And so in Romans 1, if you go up to verse 25, right before, it says they exchanged the truth about God for a lie,
Absolutely.
and worshiped and served the creature rather than the creator. And then the very next phrase is, for this reason, right? That's the reason that God gave them up to their dishonorable passions. That's the root of their dishonorable passions, is that they had no authority. And the saddest verse for me in the entire book of Judges is Judges 2:10. So Joshua dies, the elders die, and the verse says, and there arose a generation that did not know the Lord or what the Lord had done for Israel.
Yeah.
That's absolutely huge, because if we think about, we could be a generation away from our descendants not knowing the Lord or having these same type of dishonorable passions or a lack of authority in their life if we don't pass on our faith. So I don't know whether, Joshua and the elders, if they didn't do a good job raising up leaders after them, I have no idea. All I know is the Bible is very clear. A generation arose that didn't know the Lord, and now they're not acknowledging the authority of God. And as you watch what happens in the book of Judges, we're finding out that causes them to worship themselves and worship everything around them. And when we worship self, we're doing the opposite of what Matt and Chase both said. You're not going to deny yourself if you're worshiping yourself. If you're worshiping yourself, then you're opening yourself up to all kinds of debased passions and lusts. And if you're worshiping yourself, you're not going to deny anything. So everything goes. And I'm telling you this, man, the more, and this is true in my own life, I don't say this as someone who has got sin under control and is good to go, check it off. No, not at all. But the more we do sin in our life, the less intense that sin is to us. We are more and more okay with a certain sin. And the more we're okay with a certain sin, the more we'll accept the next thing down and the next thing down and the next thing down and the next thing down. And I think that's kind of what you're seeing in Judges, to the point where, when Israel rises up against the tribe of Benjamin, they ask for something very reasonable. Hey, just give us the guys that did it, right? Give us the worthless fellows that did this abomination before the Lord. Let us deal with them, and we're good. And Benjamin won't do it. They're like, nah, we're good. We'd rather go to war. We'd rather lose, 26,000 men rather than give up however many abominable fellows they were, because now they're protecting sin. And that's just, in my opinion, the cycle that you get into, that all starts with removing authority. When you remove God off his throne and you take your place on that throne and you rule your own life and you are the judge of your own world, then that next phrase, everyone did what was right in their own eyes, makes perfect sense. And again, back to my first thought, that's what we're living in today.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing too, is like, if a great way for God to punish us is to give us exactly what we want. And that's a scary place to be. And we're seeing the reality of that. And so kind of going down that chapter, we talked about this concubine, which the comments were great. And you feel free, panelists, to jump in on what you would decree a concubine to be. But this is a tough thing, and the commentators are all over the place. But as you guys have been talking with the whole Gibeah, Hosea 9 refers to it as like the glory days of evil. Like, it was, like we say, it was like Sodom and Gomorrah out there. But now, later on in the Old Testament, it's like this Gibeah is referred to as the Sodom and Gomorrah. That's how bad and low and dark Israel was here. But just talking about this dismemberment and sending out body parts, I mean, it's just a tragic scene. She was raped all night long until sunrise. She crawled to the doorstep. Just a tragic story that would have gone viral today. I mean, it's just a tragic story. But within that, and I come from a background where I heard a lot about people's biggest problem with the Bible is how it treats women. The Bible's sexist. The Bible's not good. The Bible's not good to women. And so, kind of with that theme in mind, we'll have this discussion, and then we'll kind of wrap up after this. But just with the idea of how women are treated, especially in Scripture, like, how would you defend something to say, if someone said, "Hey, the Bible's sexist. I want nothing to do with that. Women's rights are not upheld in that." What would you say back to somebody like that? And I don't know if anybody wants to go first, or I can call on Cheri. You want to take a stab at it?
Sure. again, this is one of those things I think where God is working within a society that is very patriarchal. A lot of the Canaanite nations around them, and I think I read a poll yesterday, even today, if you look today at the nations where Christianity has burgeoned and has had a great impact, those are the places where women have the most rights, the most freedoms, the most respect, and equal as far as what's come through, right, in history. If you look at the places where Christianity has been diminished, withheld, suppressed, or unoccupied territories, it's where women's rights are the worst. They are still considered inferior, still mistreated. And I just can't help but think that if you really were reading the Bible with open eyes all the way through, you would see a God who is constantly putting rules in place to protect women. It doesn't always seem like it, but he's operating within the culture that they are existing in, and he is constantly providing protection. We're going to see this again. I think tomorrow, do we read Ruth?
Yep.
And you're going to look back, because what's happening in Ruth goes back to Deuteronomy and Leviticus, to the rules that they had for the poor, the widows, and the orphan, because women really didn't have a way to provide for themselves after a husband, if they didn't have a husband or they had no sons. And yet you have all of these rules in place for field owners, where God is establishing a society that protects the weak and protects the vulnerable. And so one thing I want to say is that women, this is why we are thankful for Jesus, because he is the just first and foremost feminist for women of all. I mean, you look at in his entire life and the things that he did constantly. I'm not just talking the big ones like talking to the Samaritan woman at the well, or what he did for Mary Magdalene, or the women who traveled with him, even the woman who touched his robe. That would have been completely dishonorable to touch a rabbi's robe like that. Just the way that Jesus consistently is showing them a model example of how to value, how to treat them. And then you travel on down to Paul, and Paul in Galatians is saying things like there's no man, there's no woman, there's no sex, there's no slave, there's no master. Like we come so far through the Bible, as the patriarchal society diminishes and goes away, you see women's rights increase all the way through. But even back in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, God is constantly providing protections for women, for them to establish a line. So, I mean, you can argue that, but you're arguing from a place of ignorance, because I absolutely believe that God is for women, pro women, all the way back to Eve in the garden, with the roles that, he gave them and why she was even created. I mean, you think about the fact that he creates Adam in the image of God, and then he looks and it's like, it's not good that you're alone. And you think of all the ways in the Bible where sometimes the descriptions of God are feminist. God is a she, like she wishes, I wish I could wrap you up like a mother hen under my wings, because I fully believe that it takes both a man and a woman to display the full character of God. And so even from the very beginning, the way that he creates man and woman, different but equal. I mean, I'm just telling you, I think all the way through your argument is from ignorance, because God is pro women. That culture was not, but he never, ever okays that culture. He never supports it. He never gives them a high five or a thumbs up or approval in any way. In fact, he's constantly talking one man, one woman. You don't see polygamy succeed. You don't see concubines succeed. Look at what concubines did to Solomon. I mean, all along the way, all you see is that any time that they're treating women outside of the will of God, it doesn't go well. So that's my take.
David, what do you think? I would love to hear what your thoughts are. Like, what would you, because you are a great discusser, you're an apologetic mind. So if someone said, the Bible's sexist, what would your response be?
Well, my first question to them would be, where in the world do you find that? Show me. And then honestly, I would take the same track that Cheri did, and I would take them all the way back to the garden and go, show me where in this you see God treating women differently. You can show me all through time and history where people treat women poorly. That's been a problem forever in multiple societies, just as Cheri talked about. So, I mean, I think you have to pull apart the question and say, you're really talking about how people have treated a male-dominated culture has mistreated women, or are you really talking about God and how he treated women? Because if you talk about that, then let's go look at the actual word and how all the way back Israel treated women, how Jesus treated women. You can't really say that Christianity is anti-woman in any way, shape, or form. It's almost impossible to show that unless, unless you do, and so many people do this, you pick out 4 verses or 5 verses in Judges 19 or somewhere else, and you throw that out there. But I think it kind of ties into what we were talking about earlier with this is kind of reporting. Judges is history, and we are trying to take history and then we're adding our own commentary. And some people do that from a biblical basis, and the commentary they're adding is informed and correct. And some people do it in a way to try to belittle what we believe. And neither of those is right. You should go with what God says.
Yeah.
Right.
From a hermeneutical standpoint too, one of the things that's really good for us to do is there's a saying, I can't remember, one of my professors or somebody that wrote a book says that every text needs its day. Every Bible passage needs its day. And a lot of times when you start to hear, and I'll tell you, Leviticus is a good example of this, where you see them addressing women, and I think they were putting value on, there's a passage in there, I'm going to paraphrase it big time, but they were putting value on men and women according to the temple, and women had less value than men. We look at that passage. I think I was discussing that with Jason Haydash one time, but we were discussing that, and it would be easy to be able to say, okay, that women had no value, but the truth is, in the context, that was still liberating. So women were still being liberated within the context of the day of that passage. And so I think that's a good way to, if you're talking to somebody and you're dealing with that issue where if they're adamant about saying this passage, generally it's the context that will help you understand how they're still being freed in that. But I love that Cheri answered that, because she, first of all, she killed it, but obviously she understands this burden and also this freedom that Christianity provides. And what, I would say that we've probably not done the best job with that, of understanding that context and how Scripture works, and gives us freedom in that area. But I think what you're saying, Cheri, is so good, that there is this, God created male and female in the image of God. He created them. The reason he did that is because that is the complete picture. If we are reflecting his image, I do think it's both. And I love what you're saying about that. We miss that a lot of times. The masculine reference to God in the Old Testament is to understand his authority and his identity in being the headship, but it does not deny the role of what we have of men and women both representing the glory of God. So, man, that's a key thing. And what we're looking at, I think if you take 19 and you try to make a case for this is how God thinks about women or values women, you have no idea what this book's about, because that is obviously not at any point is there anything about the actions of Judges where we're saying, yeah, hey, do like him, think like this. That's not it at all.
Yeah, it was a detestable act that really, it shocked the moral compass of the Israelites. I mean, that it went viral, so to speak, and it's still remembered in history as we're going to read about it again in Hosea. All right, so give me a show of hands who's still with us, and we're going to close out right here with the final. This is a quick round, lightning speed here, and just to kind of close out our discussion. But just wrapping up, how would you explain to somebody, how do you read the book of Judges with a New Testament understanding? What I mean by New Testament understanding is when you read the Old Testament, you got to read it different than you would the New Testament. Not that it's bad or not at the same level, but it's pre-gospel. So a lot of people read the Old Testament and they like, you can hear sermons. You can go on YouTube right now and Google sermons, and it's like how to be Samson, how to be this, be a warrior, all these kind of pragmatism approaches to it. So how would you, with a gospel-centered New Testament fresh approach, in 30 seconds or less, how would you explain to somebody that's a tough question, but how would you explain about somebody how to read the book of Judges, the New Testament understanding? And we'll start with David, Matt, and Cheri.
Okay. So mine would be that reading Judges does two things tying it to the New Testament. It shows us that God's grace and mercy is throughout that book because he didn't just wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And second is the judges, the generals, the leaders themselves were not sufficient. They never could. They only created moments of serving God. It took Jesus to finally break the mold, to be the one who could bring us to God and permanently get him there. So I think Judges points to the inadequacy of man to reach and why we needed Jesus.
I think it's that Israel had no king, but they did have a king. And that king loved them and met them where they were, where he took on flesh in order to be what they were requiring or requesting, and to do it by paying the price that they deserved. I think that's what Judges really is. These tribes are still separated. I'm sorry to preach. These tribes are still separated. It's supposed to be lightning round. And they all have judges. They don't have kings because there's only one true king, and he came in flesh. Go.
All right, Cheri.
I guess for me, the New Testament understanding is, do you know God? That verse just haunts me, that there arose a generation that did not know God. And that can happen today. And it's ironic that we came from Deuteronomy, where it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And not only did they not love him, they did not even know him. And that's not what I want to be true of me. I want to know God. I do not want to rely on a pastor. I do not want to rely on a podcast. I do not want to rely on anything else. I want to know God for myself. I want to do the work to know him, because I want to then pass on my faith to somebody else. I don't want that to be said of my family.
Thank you, Cheri. We know you're doing that. You are raising up mighty, mighty warriors for Jesus. But thank you, panelists, for chiming in. We really appreciate your wisdom and input. And before you viewers go, I want to tell you all a few things. You can go ahead and start submitting questions even now for next week's. If you go to the Journey app, give me a hand raise if you've downloaded the Journey app. If you have downloaded the Journey app, right there on the home page, there's a little button that says "Got Questions?" ? And click on that, and you can submit questions. That way, we can go ahead and start stockpiling those for next week to make this a little more fluid. Thank you for hanging in there on our first attempt at this. We had a few technical errors, things like that, but hey, this was fun. It was a great time to interact with you guys. So registration for next week, next Wednesday, we're doing this again, different people. Registration will open up on Monday. So numbers are limited, so sign up as soon as you can. There'll be 4 different people talking about this just crazy stuff that's happening in our week's worth of reading through the Journey. So that'll be the week of Easter, which is hard to believe. So we love you guys. Thank you all for tuning in. We love you.